Good afternoon. Okay, this is our last session together this week. I've spent the past 3 days kind of talking through the numerous pitfalls and challenges, but also glistening promises of environmental policy at the international and the state level. I've discussed the various policy mechanisms available to state governments. I've explored how most of it is dependent upon trust between the population and the government, trust in that revenues from taxes will be collected and sent to the correct place, trust that we as citizens are doing the same as those around us. Yesterday we spoke about international environmental coordination and the important role that economic growth can often play in understanding climate issues, whether that is for better or for worse. And today we've discussed the current dominant routes of policy based around sustainable development and green growth, before highlighting some alternative pathways forward, particularly at the local level. To bring it together, I want one of the key takeaways of my time with you to be that for environmental policy to work, it needs to be transparent, it needs to be holistic, it needs to take into account more factors than just the environment or just the economy. It needs to address multiple issues at once and rise to meet multiple challenges all at the same time. An environmental policy that is successful is not one which is exclusively applied from the top down, but one that takes into account all of these different factors and consequences. Because we see environmental policies having externalities themselves. We saw that yesterday, the day before, with the role of injustice. And we saw that in the alternative movements today, in how they approach environmental issues and criticise dominant policies. In this last session, I'm going to stop talking for at least 2 hours and leave it to you. I'm going to ask you to explore the question on the slide above me of what should be done. Under the Paris Agreement, every state is mandated to provide an INDC, a document which outlines how they will reduce their emissions, by what figure and from what baseline. Although it is not necessarily going to be met by all states, it represents a public promise both to the international community and to its citizens of what will be done. To put things in perspective for you, I found a report which is hyperlinked here, and I'll send the slides around, from the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources of Russia, which profiled a number of interesting piece of information related to Russia and climate change, and I'm just going to read through them. This report argued that deaths from environmental disasters and hazards in Russia had increased 11-fold between 2016 and 2017. That temperatures in Russia on average were rising at more than double the rate of the world's average. That the concentration of greenhouse gases driven by economic and population growth had reached record levels in 2017. That there are now unprecedented levels of atmospheric concentrations of CO2, methane and nitrous oxide. That Russia contributed the fourth most greenhouse gas emissions behind China, the United States and India. This is no surprise to any of us. This is how economy and development works. But that the ministry report says it is 95% confident that human activity has contributed to global warming. Again, there's future dangers here as well. This isn't just about the footprints we leave behind, it's what we can expect in the future. Moscow and other big cities in Russia are expected to be at a risk of warmer weather and increasing pollution. The elderly across Russia will be much more vulnerable to these rising temperatures. A heat wave in Europe in 2003 witnessed a vast proportion of those who were killed in the heat wave were elderly. Heat waves have disproportionate impacts across our community as well. Southern Russia is argued in this report to be at more of a risk of accidents on the railroads caused by this heat warping, deforming rail tracks. The overheating of buildings during heat waves will create further problems. Importantly, the melting of permafrost will lead to the emission of a vast amount of greenhouse gases, which I'm sure we know about here. But also the forest fires will likely increase in both quantity and magnitude. With Russia being home to such vast and important forests, the threat of forest fires points to an important impact of climate change within this state. Over the past few days, I have introduced you to the nuances of environmental policy and politics. I have told you what the dominant trends are and what the alternatives can be. I've explored how there are flaws at every level of environmental policy, which are often down to a lack of transparency and accountability and trust. Now I'm turning it over to you. What would you like environmental policy to look like? Under Russia's INDC, this state is aiming to reduce GHG emissions by between 25 and 30% from 1990 levels by 2030. That's 11 years. However, the INDC, I've distributed it around, is relatively thin on the ground. What policies can there be? What is feasible? These are questions that I would like you to answer. When I started giving a lecture on Monday, I explained to you that this is not my country of expertise. If you want to talk to me about the UK and Brazil, I am more than happy to. But I am not in Brasilia, I am not in London, and I want to hear about this context. We're going to be splitting you into groups of, around 4 groups, and we'll sort that out in a minute. Within that group that you get allocated, I want you to, 1, read the INDC if you haven't already, to discuss what is in place, to think about the baseline and the current action, but then decide how you want to address this. Where do you see the most important route to this 30% reduction to be? Do you see it to be in addressing private vehicle use? If you want to stop people using cars, how will you do so? Will you provide incentives? Will you be staging popular public campaigns to make cycling more interesting and exciting for people? Would you build more public transport infrastructure? That is up to you. You might want to target the energy sector as a means to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. If so, how? Will you be concentrating on the point of extraction and burning and generation, or will you be concentrating on household energy use? Both are as valid. But why are you focusing on that, and how will you ensure that those involved will participate rather than free riding? What about our homes? Insulation, eco-efficiency, will you roll them out? I spoke on Monday about my smart meter, the importance of metering electricity, water and gas. How will that work within this context? What about our food? What about meat? You might believe that everyone should be committed to a vegetarian diet. If so, how are you going to do that? Are we going to suddenly wake up in an environmentally authoritarian state where no one is allowed to eat beef for the rest of their lives apart from on special occasions? Or will you be looking to apply a tax? It's about thinking through not just what would work, but also what challenges there may be. We looked through my carbon footprint and saw that the majority of it came from flights. How will you change that? How will you stop me flying everywhere? If you're going to apply a tax, is it going to be faced by the consumer or the airline? Because that will have different impacts and different challenges. How will you address all of this? Now, we're going to be giving you a lot of time to talk things through. We want to know what's going to be the best route forward in your minds. There's going to be 4 groups in total, and each of you are going to be coming up with 3 different policies. I want to see one policy based on an economic instrument, on tax, on subsidies, for example, on tradable permits. I want to see another policy based on non-economic, on changing our minds, on nudging us in a certain form of behavioural change. And then I want you to recognise that climate change is not just a problem which occurs and is generated at the national level. It's regional as well. It's municipal. It's urban. And the third policy I want you to come up with is either related to a city in Russia of your choice or a region also of your choice. There are nuances and complexities in different contexts. You may want to focus on a region far out east. What context is there? How is that different from here? What do we need to take into account? So I want you to design these 3 separate policies as groups. This is not a negotiation or a simulation or anything like this. This is a discussion. One of the most important things you can do to address climate change is to talk about it. And we're going to start that here. Talk to each other about where you think you should target and how that would work. Share ideas, share challenges. Define the best route forward. How can the Russian government reach its goal by 2030? Do we feel that we should grow the economy whilst doing so? Or do you think that's not an issue or something that should be taken into account? Do you feel that we should take justice considerations into account? Or should we be pushing for mitigation at all costs? Should there be more democracy or less democracy? These are all things you are welcome to discuss. So to reiterate, 3 separate policies. 1 economic, 1 non-economic, 1 regional or urban. Any questions about the task? Is everything clear? Please, we'll put you into groups now. Look through the INDC and start talking. Okay? Talking is good.